Alright, welcome back. Part 2 of Angular. So far, how many people just joined us? Okay. So far, what we have covered is the basics of Angular. We talked about how to initialize an Angular application. We talked about the root scope. We talked about ng model and input type components. We talked about controllers. We talked about dependency injection briefly. We talked about the view model, which is the new role of the controller in Angular applications. We talked about the ng repeat or the ng repeater directive. We saw how to drive business functions with something like ng click. We saw how to add new items using forms, so form submission, and we looked at how to do form validation using HTML5 and Angular. Now, we have a bunch of to-dos on the page. Refresh the page. So, I've learned about Angular, I've spoken about it. Hopefully, I'll profit and I will retire, right? Now, my to-do list is pretty sparse. My next thing might be finding, the best spot on the beach, maybe the next margarita recipe. You might have a slightly more arduous to-do list, right? You might have 50, 60 to-dos on your list, and you come to me and say, I want to find a way to search my to-dos. I should be able to search my to-dos to find a specific to-do. How do we do that? Well, we're going to use something called filters in Angular. How many people here are familiar with Unix pipes and filters? Okay. Unix pipes and filters essentially work like you can do an ls, which is a file listing, pipe it to a grep, which is a restriction, pipe it to less, which is pagination, right? What is grep? Grep is filtering, it's restriction. What is less? Less is transformation, right? There is no restriction, is given some input, displayed in some other sense, or tail it, or something like that. That's transformation, it's not restriction. Angular filters work exactly the same way. You have transformation filters, you have restriction filters. Let's take a look at both. Notice that over here, we are repeating over a collection of to-dos that we have created. If I'm going to search the to-dos, what do I need? Input box would be nice, thank you sir. I'll just say input type text. How do I capture what the user typed in? Very good. ng model. Let's just call this search text. This is violating which rule of ours? Never use primitives for models. But demonstration purposes, it's fine. Let me first show you how controllers work. We'll see if we can refactor that. I am looping over the to-dos here. And what I want is when the user types in something, it should find it in this list. Angular gives you a filter, and the way you use the filter is a pipe, just like you do in Unix. And what you say is filter this based on whatever the user typed in here. So, an easier way to read this is you can actually parenthesize this. So, take the control to-dos, pipe it through this filter, whatever the result is, loop over it, and create me li items. Does that make sense to everyone? Now, let's see how we're doing. Refresh the page, learn, speak, profit. Yeah, cool. Look at that. Now, Notice that I have a done property here called 1426. What happens if I type that? 1, 4, oops. I say ship it. User's never going to type a number in there. What's happening over here? Well, let's take a peek under the curtains and maybe we'll see what's going on. What's going on is I'm giving it some string value. Angular sees a collection of to-dos come through the pipe. It takes the value of every key and matches it with that filter. And if it matches, go, otherwise fail. What do we want to do? We want to only filter by the text value, right? By the text of the to-do. So this is the text right here. So again, it goes back to this whole notion of primitives being used as models. What I can say here is don't create a search text, create a search object that has a text property, right? Create a search object that has a text property and now filter by that object. What Angular will do is it will say everything that's being piped to me, does it have a text property? And if it has a text property, I'm going to line those two up and then match. That makes sense to everyone? Alright, so let's refresh. Learn, that works. Profit, that works. 1, nope, no match. Yes? Cool. There are lots of ways to do this, by the way. So, don't think this is the only way to do a filtering, but for now, it's contains. So, Angular matches. We'll come to writing our own filters in 1 second. But does this make sense? Now, there is another kind of filtering which is called transformation. And we already saw that in the earlier session. Remember that pipe I said, that pipe JSON? That's transformation. Given an object, pipe it through the JSON filter, which shows you the JSON representation of that object. So that is shown down below here. A lot of times you'll have to write your own filter. Actually, let's do this. Before I go there, there's another one which is called lowercase. Lowercase. So pipe the text through the lowercase filter and notice everything is now lowercase. The thing to bear in mind here is notice the model has not changed. The model still has uppercase L, learn, uppercase A, Angular. Your filter should never, ever, ever, ever monkey with the model. That is not allowed. Filters are purely view components. Just like ls-grep doesn't actually throw away directories in your file system, don't do that with the model. It is purely a view component. It is not a mutation construct. Everyone good with that? If you do it, trust me, bad things will happen. And I really mean bad things, especially if you're doing Ajax calls. Okay. A lot of times you have to write your own filter. How do we do that? Well, remember this API that we have, myapp.controller? We're going to write our own filter. We're going to say myapp.filter. Same signature. We are going to call our filter reverse. Second argument is always an array. The last item in the array is the implementation of the filter. If you have dependencies you need for this guy, for example, if your filter has to make an Ajax call and you want to inject the HTTP friend we talked about earlier, first argument is string format HTTP, that becomes HTTP in here, and now HTTP is available to you inside the function. Does that make sense? We don't need HTTP for reversing, thankfully, so I'm going to get rid of that. Now, the filter function should return the function that actually does the filtering. So this should return a function. In our case, this function will take a text value and simply return text.split.reverse.join. Does everyone know what's going on over here? I take a string value, I splice it by nothing, so I get an array of characters, I reverse the array, I join it. How do I use this? Just like we used, oops, sorry about that. Just like we used lowercase, and you have your filter. You can stagger these filters if you like. So pipe this to lowercase. And now not only does it reverse, it then lowercases it. How's everyone doing? Every once in a while, your filter may have to take an argument. For example, not only, remember when I invoke this function reverse, right? When I invoke the filter, what's happening? This text is the first argument to it, right? I can say it can take a second argument, suffix, prefix. Which one comes first? Prefix. So suffix comes later. Okay. So suffix, right? Let's just do suffix. And just for grins up here, let's try this. And this is the true live coding. There is no prep work involved at all. So input type text, ng model we'll just call it user supplied suffix, right? So this guy now not only gets him as an argument, he should get whatever the user typed in over here as the second argument. So I'm going to say colon. So the way you see this function is this is actually a function called like this. It's reverse t.text comma t.text comma user supplied. Does that make sense? The first argument is implied, whatever you are supplying in before the pipe. The second argument is whatever you put after the colon. Now let's see if this works, by the way. There's all this talk and we'll see how this works. So this is reverse. Oh, so let's do this. Plus suffix, right? Plus space plus suffix. Let's see how we do. So undefined, if I type Raju, notice that it not only reversed it, but it also tacked on whatever was supplied here. So that's the second argument to that function. Does that make sense to everyone? So the colons delimit arguments to the filter. So undo this, bless you, and undo this. Okay. Now the confusing aspect about this is what is this? This is some filter that's taking an argument, right? It's taking two arguments. What's the first argument? The to-dos array. The second argument is whatever the user typed in the search, right? The funny thing about this is not actually a keyword filter. It's actually a filter whose name is filter, which in my opinion is very confusing. They should have said restrict by or something like that. They called it filter. So just like we have reverse, they have a filter called filter, which whatever sense that makes to them, but whatever. Just be sure you understand that. Now you come to me and say, that's all good and dandy. Let's try something. Oh, let me get rid of this reverse, by the way. That's annoying. Okay, let's try something else. So that works. And I am going to order, this is another one that Angular ships with, order by the to-do's done property. So let me just make this a little bit smaller. Okay, so controller to-do's pipe filter pipe order by. This is yet another filter. It's not a restriction filter, it is a transformation filter. It just sorts things differently. And this is going to sort by the done property on the to-do. I'll make sure this works. Refresh. Notice nothing changed here. Why? Yes, it's ascending order. So this has got a done property. If I remove this and check this, notice speak bumps up to the top, right? Another thing the astute viewer might have noticed is this is not just HTML being generated. It's HTML that's generated and monitored by Angular, right? As I type, things disappear, come back in the DOM. As I sort and filter, things move around. Angular is doing all the work. Now, obviously you don't want the done item on the top. You want the done item at the bottom. So how do we do that? It's pretty obvious. You negate this. And you see learn Angular go to the bottom. Cool? Everyone doing okay so far? Any questions? Oh, I'm sorry. Forgive me, sir.
What is this keyword for filters? Or is that just every thing that happens?
Oh, you mean what is this over here? That will be the newly created, so that's a little complicated. Well, it depends on which this you mean. Do you mean this here? Or do you mean this? That will be the filter function. But you very rarely ever need that. Because, again, remember there are two things over here. One, filters are almost always stateless, right? Number one. So this implies state. This implies giving the current context. Very rarely do you need that. If you are, let me hold on and recall here. No, this, yeah, it will be the new filter, but it's not this like a constructor called this. It just happens to be contextually the object that represents the filter. My suggestion, avoid that. It's going to cause confusion. Is there a reason you asked for that question, or was it just curiosity? 1 second. Okay, sorry, the door behind me was open. I could hear you.
It was curiosity, but also that helped answer my question.
Okay, all right. All right, so that's filtering and ordering. Now, as you can tell, it's kind of easy to write your own filters. The other thing you might have noticed is everything goes on to that namespace we created, right? It's always on the namespace we created. Don't just leave it hanging out there. Actually, you can't leave it hanging out there. You have to tack it on a namespace. Yes, sir. Oh, you want a third parameter? What's your name? I'll just put Raju there. Sorry, I didn't want to make you spell it across the room, right? So three arguments, right? So going back here, you would do something like pipe this to what did we call it? Reverse colon first argument. So let's just do quotes blah colon other. So again, implicitly the first argument is this text. Colon 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 is as many arguments as you want to supply it to. So the colon is the delimiter in HTML, what comma is on the JavaScript side. That's it. Does that answer your question? Good. Anyone else? Yes, sir. So that's a good question. The question is, why is there a function inside a function? Right? So let me just get rid of this reverse for a second. So his question is, why does this function return another function, right? The reason for that goes back to dependency injection. Let's say this guy had to make an Ajax call to the server and come back with some data, right? The way Angular does things is it does it by dependency injection. So they had one of two options. They could do $HTTP here and say, this is a dependency for the function. I need this dependency, right? But the problem is now this signature is confusing, right? Because when I invoke this function, someone has to supply this to me. So what they did is they wrapped the whole thing in a function. So now here I can inject HTTP and it's available to me anywhere inside this function. So the signature of this function remains exactly what you expect it to be, is give me the text, give me any arguments, and in here I can say $HTTP.get, and I'll show you what this means in a second. This is just an Ajax call, get me reverse with these arguments. So if you have to make an Ajax call, you want to keep that dependency injection outside of the filter function. Does that kind of make sense? I know it's a little confusing, but the point is they needed to separate how dependency injections happen from the definition of the filter function. Those are two separate concerns. Everyone doing okay? All right. So get rid of this, get rid of this. What else did I break? All right, so everything kind of works. All right. So we can mark to-dos as done. We can add new to-dos with validation. We can search. Now, one thing I did want to point out earlier, which is part of the validation things we talked about, is something, it's a little subtle, but it's very useful. So let me just show you what happens here. Remember that form that we had, right? This form, and I said min length is 5 and this is required, right? Every once in a while, this may not be all you want, right? This only tells you if the form is valid or invalid. It doesn't tell you why the form is valid or invalid, right? So there is under the covers, let me do an H2 here, and I can evaluate this form dot $error. So you can see down below here that there's an object attached to that. Remember that form control I told you about that gets created when you have a nested form inside an Angular application? He has an errors object and he has this really long list of properties attached to him. What's interesting about him is I can actually get to any control. Let's give this guy a name. So I'm going to give it the most obvious name. I'll just call it input. I can say add to do form dot input dot error. Let's see what that says. Notice it says required true. So you can interrogate that object to do clever stuff, right? You can interrogate that object to maybe display a message down here or display an asterisk on required fields or whatever you have. So I can do something over here like this. I can use this guy, copy, and here I can say span, and there's another directive called ng show, which means show this if this condition is true. So I am going to say if the to do form dot input field dot error dot required, then put a star. Right, let me just show you how this works. Now, people in the back can't see that, so I'll zoom in. See that star over there? Now, if I start typing, it disappears because that required field, constraint is now gone. Does that make sense? We can do other things. We can do something more clever. You can say $error.required. Notice there's also min length. So I can say ngShow.minLength then should be at least, oops, I'm zoomed in, sorry, should be at least 5. Why won't this zoom? Okay, anyways, should be at least 5, it doesn't matter. Point is, let's try and see how this works. So I have a star and then I type A and then it says should be at least 5. And then I do B, C, D, E and it goes away. Does that make sense to everyone? So you can have that object to interrogate to do some fancy business. I'll show you one thing right after I answer your question.
I just want to ask, I assume that you can do the same thing with time classes to
Yes, absolutely. Yep. In fact, this became such a prolific problem in the Angular community with people doing this monkey business of ngShow. They introduced a new module in 1.3 called ng messages. And ng messages can pivot off of any form, and based on what error conditions you see, you can say display this span, display this span. So there's something called ng messages. If you find yourself doing something like this, drop down, include ng messages and use that. Don't ng show business. It will do that ng showing for you. Just an FYI. Oh, okay. Cool. All right. So not bad for about what, 2 hours of work? Yeah. Now, this is the part where things get confusing. We're going to talk briefly about routing and then we'll look at Ajax calls. Remember earlier when I showed you Gmail and I said #inbox #imp and I said the MVC framework looks at the URL and says get this data from the server or get this data from the server, right, based on the URL. How many people have done MVC on the server side in the room? Okay. The notion of MVC is very simple. I have a controller. The controller is tied to a specific URL, right? And based on the URL, a controller activates and a specific method on that controller activates to either return some data or return some JSON or whatever you have. That's primarily the role of the controller, is switch between URLs and return the right views. In Angular, the way you do that is the first thing you do is you have to include something called ng-route. Now, let me show you where that comes from. Oops. If you look at all the files I've included, there is a file called AngularRoute. AngularRoute is Angular's routing engine. It's a separate module that you can include if you need it. The nice thing about that is that because it's a separate module, you don't have to use Angular's routing engine for your application. There are other routing engines that are written for Angular that you can include. It doesn't matter. Up until 1.1, that was a part of Angular. So you didn't have a choice. You had to use what they gave you. 1.2, they extracted it as a separate component. So they have Angular core, Angular routing. If you like to mix the two, mix them. If you don't like, use something else. So the first thing you do obviously with any HTML file is you include it. So up here I am going to include it. Okay, so we've got Angular route being loaded. This, remember the square brackets I told you, and I told you not to forget these square brackets. They are for module injection. So up until now we've only seen dependency injection for functions. This is a module injection. This basically tells Angular, my application depends on this guy. So Angular will first instantiate this guy, and whatever he provides is available to me inside my namespace. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say my app.configure yourself. This is a configuration option, has to get bootstrapped before your application or just after your application wakes up. There is an object called route provider. And that route provider takes a function. Now, if you don't follow all of this completely, that's fine. Just get the basic premise. Oh, I'm sorry. This makes no sense. Oh, by the way, you can also do the array signature here. So that's, route provider followed by a function that gets the route provider injected into him and curly brackets. Now, what am I trying to do here? What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say $route provider dot when the URL is something. Remember Gmail, it was hash inbox, right? And I had to do some work. So the second argument to when is an object that configures that view. We're not going to use inbox. We're going to say slash to-dos. Right. When the current URL is slash to-dos, please use a HTML template called views/todos.html. I'll show you what this is in a second. And use a controller. What controller do we use? We can just use this guy. Oh. And remember that aliasing thing I talked about? This thing? The VM thing? You can say controller as, what did I call it there? CTRL. Oh, that's creative. So, outside of all the machinery that's kicking in, just think about it this way. When your application is served by the server, it will have some URL, right? mytodos.com, something like that. What I'm saying is if the URL changes to mytodos.com/todos, Angular needs to intercept that request and serve up this view with this as its controller, and this is the alias for the controller. On the other hand, if the user typed in todos.com/pizza, right, which makes no sense in my application, what I can do is I can say .when otherwise redirect I think I'm getting the syntax wrong over here. Oh, I don't need an object there. That's what I'm doing wrong. Redirect to /todos. So basically what I'm saying here is if the URL is /todos, use that view. Otherwise redirect it to something that I understand. Now let's say you had one more URL called /edit. So /todos/ID. Does everyone understand this syntax? :ID. They don't know what that means. It means that after to-dos there could be anything following a slash. And then do something there. Use some template, use some controller, whatever. Does that kind of make sense to everyone? Okay. This is obviously going to blow up because I'm sure I have a typo in there. Yeah. Okay. What did I mess up? So curly brackets should be here. Yeah, I think I've got this is a syntax error here somewhere. Otherwise, I'll check that in a second, but this is a syntax error. Okay. Okay. Now again, remember, nothing changes here. Why? Because I'm not actually serving the file up from a server. I'm opening up a file. So this makes no sense from a file perspective. There has to be a URL that makes valid sense in this context. So while we keep talking, I'm going to wake up my server. How many Clojure users in the room? Any Clojure users? Good man. If you haven't looked into Clojure, you need to look into it. I'm going to wake up my server while I talk. Now, how many people have used RESTful endpoints before this? Very nice. So, this is the contract the backend guys gave me. You know those guys who sit in grimy, badly lit corridors and write Java code? They gave me this. They said if you hit /todos on that domain, we will send you back all the to-dos in that database for that user. If you do a get on /todos / give me some ID, some valid ID, I will get you only that to do. If I post on /todos, again, this is what? This is CRUD over HTTP, which we these days fashionably call REST, right? But conceptually, the point still applies. Post /todos creates a new to-do, put on a /todo /:ID updates the to-do, and a HTTP delete on to-dos /ID deletes the to-do with that ID. Everyone make sense with this? Good. That's the endpoint. That's what they are offering me. I have to make use of this. Now, how many people, again, I told you you start to hate me at this point, right? Because there are three things that come into play over here. Ajax calls, routing, and promises. How many people have used promises in this room? Couple of hands, not as many as HTTP REST people. So let me give you the 5-minute 411 on promises. There is a library by Chris Corval, I think, called Q, the letter Q, which I have no idea what that's supposed to mean. But there's a library called Q, which is the default go-to for everyone in JavaScript land. Angular ships with a more lightweight version of a promises library, confusingly called $Q. $Q is heavily inspired by Chris's library, but it is part of Angular. It is not the same library. Q is a promises library. Now, as an analogy, let's say I owe you money, right? I owe you money. And I say I'm going to defer paying you back till I get my paycheck 2 weeks from now. Everyone good with that? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to defer this job of getting paid, and I'm going to make you a promise. I'll give you a promise object. Now, let's say I get paid 2 weeks from now. I should invoke something on the promise that gets you the money I owe you, right? Do I care what you do with that money? No. Is it my responsibility? No. So what I do is I give you a promise object. What you do on that promise object is you register a callback, which says if Raju gets paid, he will invoke this function, do something in that function. For example, throw a party or save it in the bank or whatever. Now, there's a very good chance I'll get fired before the 2 weeks are over, and I can't pay you back. I will invoke a failure function on that promise. And then, do I care what you do with that failure? Nope. You can write me off your life forever, right? You can threaten me, whatever you like. So in code, the way this works is that portion, right, that I said I am deferring for 2 weeks is an object, right? So I can invoke a function on the Q library that says, please defer some operation. So generally there's an operation over here that happens, but don't worry that for now. That gives you a deferred object of some sort. Now, remember, that's just me saying I'll get paid in the future. I will defer getting paid for 2 weeks. I have to still give you a promise object. So on that is something called deferred.promise. There's a property on it called promise, which is what I'm going to hand you. That's my promise to you. Now, what you do is on that promise object, let me call this P because it's confusing. I'll just call this P. So P dot then, right, this takes 2 arguments, success, failure. Oh, that's not how you spell success, right? So function success, console.log, party, woohoo, right? So what I'm saying is, if this promise succeeds, do this. On the flip side, function failure, CL right? So what are you doing? On the promise, you're registering 2 functions, failure, success. I will invoke either failure or success once that 2 weeks is over. Now, under the covers, the way I get paid, remember that deferred guy we had? He has an invocation on him called resolve. Resolve means I got my paycheck. When I get my paycheck, when this function gets called, under the covers, the Q library will invoke your success function. So when I come back, that function gets invoked. Does that make sense to everyone? I know there are 2 pieces here, but bear in mind, you are holding the promise, I'm the one who's resolving or rejecting. And you and I cannot be connected in any way, except by that promise. What if I get fired? Then I can reject that deferred job, and then your failure function will get invoked. Does that make sense to everyone? The point of this entire thing is that there can be any job that is deferred, and that will hand you back a promise. On the promise, you can attach failure and success functions, and they will get invoked based on whatever work was deferred, whether it succeeded or failed. That's all. That's all you have to take away from this discussion. Now, the nice thing about this then guy is you can chain them. Each then returns the promise itself. So I can say then another success, success 1, success 1, party woohoo, go to Vegas, right? And failure 1, right? So I can say if this got rejected, then P's failure will get invoked, and then if there's another success 1, failure 1 registered, they will get fired in sequence. Every failure gets fired in sequence. Clear as mud? Alright. All this to say, let's talk about Ajax. What I'm going to do here real quick is I'm going to reset. Actually, let me take a step back over here and make sure I didn't screw something up. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
The second then,
Uh-huh.
I think it's called node 1 rejection.
Sorry, so let me go back. Are you talking about this? Oh, wait.
Why you get 2 failures.
So why you have this and this? So let's say I owe you money, right? And you owe him a bachelor party, right? You're waiting on me to pay you. If I succeed, I'll call your success function. Let's say, for example, right? What you can do here, and I'll show you why this is important in 1 second, but I'll show you why this is. So remember this promise object, right, that we got from me? I gave you a promise object. What you can do is you can register this, and what's your name? Scott. You can say, is that. So I give you a promise object, you register 2 callbacks, success and failure, which give you back another promise object that you hand to him. He registers success and failure, which means now there are 3 parties involved. I am the one who's waiting for a paycheck. If I succeed, I invoke your success function. When your success function returns, it will automatically invoke his success function. And none of us are tied together except for the fact that everyone's handing each other a promise.
So if they're chained, like in your, how you had it originally, how do you reject the second one? How do you achieve a rejection state?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So, okay, let me, before I jump to conclusions. So your question is, what if here you got a success call, but here you want to invoke failure? Is that your question? Well, so the ideal situation there is if I succeed and my success gets called back, then most likely your success will get called back, right? So if this gets called back, then this guy will turn around and call this success one. In here, if you take whatever object was given to you, so let me do this. This success failure that you see here, let's say you had a handle to the $Q object, right? Here you can say reject. And you were successfully paid, but you won't throw him a bachelor party. You can turn your success, but make it look like his will fail. That's completely possible. Doesn't very rarely happens. People do reject in the middle of a promise, but it very rarely happens. But that's just you being mean to him. Why would you not throw him a bachelor party? No, seriously, why wouldn't you throw him a bachelor party? Does that kind of answer your question? Yeah, you can reject in anywhere. So this, and it throws, and actually to answer your question in its entirety, there is yet another method called catch, which means if any of those thens throws an exception, the catch will get with the tail end of everything. So none of the middle thens will get called, catch will get called directly. And the reason, have you done Ajax callbacks? Yes, this avoids that hell. Because rather than having callback inside callback inside callback, what you have is a linear flat invocation of methods. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, sir. Good question. So the question he has is, obviously when I resolve, most likely this is me getting paid, right? It returns some data. If the resolve returns data, you can pass it. Let's say this success function had a data, it will get passed in as the argument to that function. And that's where HTTP things get really useful. Right. So it depends on, yeah. So whatever resolve returns and whatever reject returns will get piped down the then. Now I realize all of this is abstract, and I know you all told me you'll hate me. 2 minutes. Let's talk. Is my server up? Yes. So now I am serving up files on port 3000. Let us see. This is the to-do list that came back from the server. So first, what I'm going to do is show you what happened to my console. Oh, that's right. So I realize it's going to be hard. So let me refresh the page. So notice first and foremost, let me do this. So notice my URL. Oh, come on, don't do that. Really? Sorry, my bad. Okay. So notice the URL, right? First and foremost. I'm going to hit enter. Oh, wait. How did all my to-dos disappear? Well, it earlier said meet great developers at Devnexus and fly back home and weep, right? I'm sorry, what was that you said? Oh, did I? Oh, wait, I know what I did. I know what I did. I know what I did. That's what I did. There you go. Okay. So we had hard-coded to-dos in that main.js file. So although I was serving data from the server, I wasn't using it. I was using that hard-coded array. That's why in the server view you were seeing that. That's what happened. Okay. Second time lucky. I'm going to go to localhost 3000. I hit enter. Notice what happened to the URL. It became //todos. The reason for that is actually this. When I requested this guy, it actually sent me back something, a get. Then Angular woke up and turned around and made another request to /todos, and I'll tell you why. Here is our main.js file now. Notice that route provider that we had. I say when /todos do some work, when /todos ID do some work, otherwise redirect to /todos, which means that this is not a valid URL as far as Angular is concerned. Angular sees that URL and says, let me check my configuration real quick. Oh no, I should redirect to /todos. And so the minute I hit enter here, Angular intercepts and says /todos is not a valid request, turn around, make a /todos request. And what does our contract tell us? It says if you do a get /todos, you return all the to-dos. And that's what happens under the covers. How's everyone doing with this? Kind of making sense? Okay. So that is the deep linking for single page application. Like if you look at Twitter, they also have that hash something. You can get rid of that because you can do an HTML5 history enabled setting and get rid of that. But the typical default behavior for most single page apps is the hash. See, if you only had slash to-dos, right, it's hard to discern, is that a server request or is that an Angular request, right? Normally what your links are, what are they? You know, www.mycompany.com/something. And where does that request go? To the server. So the hash tells Angular, you need to intercept. Again, that's a very layman's term, but you get the gist. Now, let me show you the HTML first. I am injecting HTTP and Q into this function. Remember, HTTP is who? Mr. Ajax, right? And I have a method called getToDos. GetToDos is return $HTTP. This is dollar, what is the jQuery equivalent? $Ajax.get. Is that the equivalent? Same thing. Mr. Ajax, get me that URL. What does that return you? It returns you a promise. That is the work that's going to get done. I'm going to hand you back a promise. What I do with that promise is I register a handle success and a handle error function. Now, when that thing gets resolved, right, the Ajax call actually goes through the data, the server is going to send me some data, right? So what I do with the handle success function is I get that response back, and from that I return again response.data. So this is you throwing him the bachelor party. I handed you a response on the callback. You turn around and hand him the data from that response object. Alternatively, if I fail, I call handler error, which in my case, notice what I do. Reject, which means I failed, so you tell him, sorry dude, no bachelor party. Does that kind of make sense? Promises are confusing, but for what it's worth, if you're going to do any kind of single page application development, wrap your head around this. It's tricky, but it's useful. Now, what I do, so for what it's worth, this file changed significantly between our version and this version because the Ajax calls are just that verbose. So in our controller, I say, get the to-dos, which is that function we just called. Again, remember that returns a promise. So I say whatever data I get from it, set vm.todos to that data. That's all I'm saying. So my deferred, promise. 3 people. From me, you extract the response.data, give it to him. From him, he hands it to her and she says, set some property on me. That's all that's going on here. People are handing over data 3 levels deep. This is our view model. This is our controller over here. So if I were to refresh and open this up, that's handy. Actually, you know what? I'm going to get rid of this and open up Firebug. Refresh, and get to dos is a JSON response with 3 objects in it, with some ID, timestamp, speak to developers, fly back home, blah blah blah. So that's the get. That's how you do a get in an Angular. If you had to do a post, so what's our contract again? Our contract is if I say delete /todo/ID, it will delete the ID, the to do with that ID. So in my UI, I have a trash icon, and if I were to focus down here and I hover, oh, this is an HTTP delete. So let me do this. Clear, where's clear? Clear. click this button. Notice it posts a delete and I refresh the to-dos list. So this is actually gone. If I refresh the page, it's gone on the back end. So delete is simple, it's trivial, right? http.delete, if I'm successful, do something, if I error, do something. And again, the pattern just keeps repeating. Add new to-do, post on to-dos with a new to-do, if I succeed, if I fail, blah, 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 blah. How's everyone doing with this? I know this is confusing, this whole routing, promises, Ajax call, because they all have to come together to make a single page application work. So there's a lot of machinery that comes into play. Is everyone doing okay with this? Yes, sir. Yes. Oh, you mean if you don't want Ajax? Oh, sorry, if you don't want JSON? Yes. So that's the default behavior is it assumes you're getting JSON out of the wire and will deserialize it for you. Yep. Anyone else? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, sir. Hold on. Let me come on that side. Yes. Sure. So the question he has is, what is this factory business all about? Right. So he said, what is this factory business all about? Earlier, we had app.controller, first controller, and then I had an array, and then I had a function with a var to do's is an array, right? And then I said this equals, VM equals this, and VM dot to do's is to do's, right? This is what I had earlier. The view model put a to do's array on that. Now here's the problem. If I have two controllers, say second controller, and he needs the same exact to do. He needs the same copy. How do I share two things in Angular? Now, again, remember, I love global variables, right? You too. So between you and me, right? Between you and me, we are perfectly happy doing that, right? Now everybody sees the global to-dos and you and I are fine. And you know, 5 years from now, they'll all come begging for our advice. But outside of that, the others might not be so pleased with this idea. So what Angular suggests you do is you can create what is known as a factory. Now, people who are used to object-oriented programming, Java land, C# land, when I use the word factory, what comes to mind? It's a class, but it's a factory means it pumps out new objects, right? Call this factory, it will give you an object. Call this factory, it will give you a new object, right? It's something that pumps out new objects. This is the confusing terminology over here. Angular's got something called app.factory. App.factory, you can give it a name. So I'm going to call it to-do service, right? Which again, always, second argument is an array. The last item in the array is the function body of that service. Now, let's do this. I'm going to return from this function the to-dos array. Okay, I'm just going to return the to-dos array. Now remember, what is our objective? Our objective is to share data between two controllers. So what I can do now is I can use dependency injection. I can say this first controller has a dependency on this service and this guy has a dependency on this service. So now I can do a local variable like this, right? Now, this is generally not a good idea. I should probably have not done this. I'll return an object which has a to-dos property on it, which is the array of to-dos, right? So now, once I have the to-dos, I can simply say to-dos dot, and then here I say to-do service. And again, for those who are following along, I'll come back to what I'm doing over here in a second. Remember, dependency injection is all about what? Given a name of something, go look it up for me, inject it into me. What I'm saying here is go look for something called to-do service. Angular goes around and says, ooh, you got a factory called to-do service. I am going to invoke this function. Whatever the function returns will be injected into whatever function depends on me. Does that make sense to everyone? Now, here's the catch. Based on this example, oh, I'm sorry about that. Based on this example, if Angular sees to-do service here and to-do service here, should it invoke this function once or twice? The point is to share data. If I invoke this function twice, how many of these objects do I get? 2, which is not what I want. The thing to take away from here is factories in Angular are singletons, which means that once this guy got instantiated here, he will never be instantiated ever again. So it's not like a factory in the traditional O sense. It's a way to say, here's a way to create a singleton object which can be injected anywhere you need it. That's what factories are all about. They are a way. So if you ever find yourself writing domain logic in your controller, extract it into a factory and inject it back into the controller. Don't put domain logic inside the controller. Does that make sense to everyone? This is one of the more confusing aspects of Angular, is trying to leverage the dependency injection. But it's all about the name lookup and the fact that this function will only get invoked once. Everyone good? Alright, any other questions? Man, you guys are a quiet crowd. Well, that was what I had for the demonstration. So if you don't have any questions, feel free to take. Yes, sir.
Where was the part where, so I understand that like when you click on the delete, it's calling the delete. Is it going back and then doing another get to update the model, or is there
Yes, yes. So that's a good question. So I have two parts here. I have a controller and I have a service. So let's look at the delete because it's the easiest one to understand. The delete just does this. It sends a delete, HTTP delete to the server and says, go blow away this ID for me. What the controller does, in my case, is it says delete that ID and then refresh my to-dos. So look at the refresh function here. It does a to-do service.get to-dos again and it gets the entire list. Now, please don't do this in production, right? You don't get all your to-dos because one disappeared, right? You just refresh the list in the view. This for demonstration purposes, it's fine. But the point is, yes, I'm doing delete and then I turn around and do a get on all the to-dos under the cover. So good eye over there. Yes, sir.
The question isn't really about what you showed us about Angular. I know that Angular is going through a lot of rewrites that are using it fast. Google's also kind of really nice new shiny things with all of them. You still see Angular being a big player. I think that's still a lot of time for this. I think the push their efforts to fall.
Okay, so the question is, there are two questions. One, Angular is seeing a lot of movement, a lot of churn. Is there a concern there or was that just a comment? Okay, so then the second question is, Angular has another project called Polymer. Polymer is based on web components. Angular is developing both Google is developing both Angular and Polymer, and the question is, what is the future of Angular if Polymer might be the future? Which, when you think about it, web components are the future. If you have not looked into web components, you need to look into Polymer. Those are the future. The answer to your question, as far as I understand where Google stand on this is remember those directives we talked about, ng model and all those things? If you really look under the covers, they are components with life cycles. They get instantiated, they watch things. If you remove that element from the DOM, they die. So the long-term view from the Angular team is they are going to take Polymer components and wrap them with Angular. So you get the full life cycle of a web component, you get all the benefits of a web component, but you get the binding and all that from Angular. That is the long-term view, at least as where it stood a couple of months ago. So I don't see, they don't play in the same field, right? Components are different than, you don't need one to do the other, but you can always combine the two to make something, improve developer productivity. So if you look at, what's their other project from Mozilla, which is also web component based, you can use that with like Backbone or something. It's a completely viable option. So one doesn't replace the other. And I don't think in Google's world, one is going to replace the other. Does that hopefully answer your question? Yeah. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Is there a UI framework that's usually used in this Angular? So, for instance, you can use JSF and find bases like so on. For common UI components, something like that. You gotta implement your own style.
So Angular, so I mean, when it comes to the HTML5 world, you know, there's always separation of concerns. So you've got the view component, pure styling, which is like Bootstrap or Foundation or whatever, Zerb Foundation or whatever, right? That's just pure view, buttons, component, stuff like that. There is also an Angular UI project that's been instantiated, which is for like grids and stuff like that. And then the big thing is Wesley Hales was here in this room just before I came, and he was speaking about, well, I don't know what he talks about. He doesn't know what he's talking about. But he wrote a directive to manipulate graphs in Angular. So they wrap other components and expose them as directives. So that's another way to make a component in Angular, is you wrap it in a directive, and then you can literally ship that directive to anyone you want. Like, you know, if you have a D3 Angular directive, I can use it as long as I know the API. Perfectly valid. All right, well, you guys have been awesome. Thank you all for coming in. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Blah, blah, blah. Thank you. Thank you.